In the grand halls of Buckingham Palace, where every gesture carries the weight of centuries and every glance is scrutinized by millions, there are moments that reveal the true heart beneath the crown. Sometimes, it's not what is said that speaks the loudest, but what remains unspoken. Sometimes, it's not the hand that should be reached for, but the one that actually is. On a crisp autumn evening in 2023, as golden light filtered through the palace's towering windows, King Charles III made a choice that would send ripples through the monarchy, through his family, and through the very foundation of royal protocol. It was a simple gesture, reaching out his hand, but the person he reached for, and the person he didn't, would become a moment frozen in time, witnessed by those present and felt by millions who would never know the full story. This is not just a tale of royalty and duty. It's a story about a father's love, a stepmother's quiet resignation, and a daughter-in-law who became the bridge between a fractured family and a hopeful future. It's about the moment when King Charles chose his heart over convention, when silence spoke louder than any royal proclamation, and when the future of the British monarchy was quietly, but definitively, decided in the span of a single, reaching hand. What happened in that hall, and why did it matter so much? The answer lies not in grand gestures or public declarations, but in the quiet moments when we think no one is watching, and when, perhaps, those are the moments that matter most. The morning of October 15th dawned gray and misty over London, the kind of weather that seemed to wrap the city in a blanket of contemplation. Inside Buckingham Palace, King Charles III stood before the tall windows of his private study, watching the last autumn leaves dance their way to the ground. At 74, he had waited longer than any heir in British history to wear the crown, and now, more than a year into his reign, he was still learning the delicate balance between being a monarch and being a man. The events that would unfold later that evening had been set in motion weeks earlier, though no one could have predicted their significance at the time. It had started with a simple family dinner invitation, something that should have been routine for any family. But nothing was ever truly routine when you were the House of Windsor. Catherine, Princess of Wales, had been the one to suggest it. She had noticed the growing tension between her father-in-law and his wife, Queen Camilla, a strain that had become more apparent since the coronation. The weight of public scrutiny, combined with the complex dynamics of a blended royal family, had created an atmosphere of careful politeness that bordered on coldness. "Perhaps we could all have dinner together," Kate had mentioned to William during one of their morning walks through the gardens of Adelaide Cottage. "Just family. No protocols, no staff hovering about, no photographers." William had looked at her with that expression she knew well, the one that said he understood exactly what she was trying to do and loved her for it. Kate had always possessed a remarkable ability to see beyond the surface of situations. Where others saw the polished veneer of royal life, she saw the human beings underneath, struggling with the same emotions and challenges that affected any family. She had married into the most scrutinized family in the world, but she had never lost sight of the fact that they were, at their core, still people who loved and hurt and hoped just like everyone else. The dinner invitation had been extended through the proper channels, of course. Even family gatherings required careful coordination in the royal household. But Kate had made sure to personally speak with both Charles and Camilla, emphasizing that this was meant to be an intimate family evening, not a royal function. Charles had accepted immediately, his voice carrying a warmth that Kate had come to treasure. Since becoming king, he had seemed to carry the weight of centuries on his shoulders. But, in moments like these, she caught glimpses of the man who had become like a second father to her. Someone who shared her love of gardening, her concern for environmental issues, and her deep commitment to duty. Camilla's response had been more measured, more careful. "How lovely," she had said. But Kate detected something else in her tone, a hesitation, perhaps, or a weariness that went deeper than simple fatigue. Camilla had fought her own battles to find acceptance within the royal family and among the British public. The journey from being seen as the woman who broke up a fairy tale marriage to becoming queen consort had been long and often painful. As the days leading up to the dinner passed, Kate found herself thinking more and more about the complex web of relationships that defined their family. There was William, her husband, who carried the dual burden of being heir to the throne, and the son who had lost his mother too young. There was Harry, whose absence from these gatherings had become a constant, aching presence in their lives. And there were George, Charlotte, and Louis, growing up in the fishbowl of royal life, but somehow managing to maintain the joy and innocence that children deserved. The venue chosen for the dinner was significant in its very ordinariness, the smaller dining room at Clarence House, Charles's London residence. It was a room that had seen countless family meals over the years, decorated with personal photographs and artwork that spoke of lives lived rather than merely displayed. The mahogany table could seat 12 comfortably, but for this evening, only 6 chairs would be occupied. Kate had arrived early that evening, bringing with her a bouquet of flowers from her own garden at Amber Hall. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke to her understanding of the importance of making spaces feel like home rather than like stages. She found Charles in his study, reading through correspondence with his trademark attention to detail. "You don't have to work until the very last minute," she had said gently, setting the flowers on a side table. "Tonight is about family." Charles looked up from his papers, and Kate saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, perhaps, at being reminded that he could simply be a grandfather and father-in-law for one evening. "You're quite right, my dear," he said, setting down his pen. "I sometimes forget that not everything requires the attention of the king." It was moments like these that revealed the man behind the crown, the person who had spent 7 decades preparing for a role that could never truly be prepared for. Kate had learned to read these subtle signs, the slight slump of shoulders when he thought no one was looking, the way his fingers drummed against his leg when he was processing difficult decisions, the rare smile that reached his eyes when he spoke about his grandchildren. Camilla arrived precisely on time, as she always did, dressed in a simple but elegant navy dress that Kate recognized as one of her favorites. She greeted Kate with genuine warmth, but there was something else there too, a carefulness that hadn't been present in their previous interactions. It was as if she was conscious of being watched and judged, even in what was meant to be a private family setting. "The flowers are beautiful," Camilla said, admiring Kate's arrangement. "From your garden?" "Yes, the last of the autumn blooms," Kate replied. "I thought they might brighten the room." It was the kind of small talk that filled the spaces between deeper conversations, but even in these simple exchanges, Kate sensed undercurrents of tension that she couldn't quite identify. Camilla seemed more reserved than usual, more formal, as if she was holding something back. William arrived with the children shortly after, and the atmosphere immediately lightened. George, at 10, was old enough to understand the formality usually required in royal settings, but young enough to still run to his grandfather with the unguarded enthusiasm of childhood. Charlotte, 8, was becoming increasingly aware of the cameras that followed their family's every move, but, in the safety of her grandfather's house, she allowed herself to simply be a little girl excited about dinner with family. 5-year-old Louis was entirely unconscious of anything beyond the immediate joy of being somewhere new and interesting, full of books and pictures and the kind of treasures that made exploration irresistible. His delight in discovering a collection of antique toy soldiers in one of the drawing rooms brought genuine laughter from both Charles and Camilla, creating the first moment of the evening where the atmosphere truly relaxed. The dinner itself was served informally, with staff quietly ensuring that everything was perfect while remaining as unobtrusive as possible. Kate had specifically requested that the meal feel like a family gathering rather than a royal function, and the kitchen had responded with comfort foods prepared with the kind of attention to detail that only the royal household could provide. Conversation flowed easily at first, centered largely on the children's activities and upcoming engagements. George spoke enthusiastically about his rugby matches, Charlotte shared stories from her dancing lessons, and Louis provided a running commentary on everything from the patterns on the wallpaper to the taste of his vegetables. Charles was in his element as a grandfather, asking thoughtful questions and listening with the kind of attention that made each child feel like the most important person in the room. But, as the meal progressed, Kate began to notice subtle changes in the dynamics around the table. William was watching his father carefully, as if trying to read something in his expression that others might miss. Camilla, while participating in the conversation, seemed somehow separate from it, as if she was present but not entirely engaged. The moment that would later become seared in everyone's memory began innocuously enough. Charles had been telling a story about a recent visit to one of his charitable organizations, a program that helped young people develop job skills. It was the kind of work that genuinely energized him, and his passion for the cause was evident in every word. "The young man I met yesterday," Charles was saying, had been homeless for 3 years before finding this program. Now he's training to be an electrician, has his own flat, and is planning to propose to his girlfriend. It's exactly the kind of transformation that makes all the work worthwhile. Kate found herself moved by the story, not just because of its inherent hope, but because of the way Charles told it, with genuine pride in what others had accomplished and humility about his own role in making it possible. This was the man she had come to know over the years, someone who saw his position not as an entitlement, but as an opportunity to make a real difference in people's lives. As Charles finished his story, he reached for his water glass, and in that moment, Kate noticed something that would stay with her long after the evening ended. His hand trembled, just slightly, but enough to be noticeable. It was a small thing, easily missed, but it spoke to the enormous pressure he carried every day, the weight of representing not just a family or even a nation, but an institution that spanned centuries. Without thinking, Kate reached across the table and briefly touched his arm, a gesture of support and understanding that came from her heart rather than from any sense of protocol. Charles looked at her with surprise and gratitude, and in that moment, something shifted in the room's atmosphere. It was then that William spoke up, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone at the table pay attention. "Papa," he said, "I think we need to talk about the future, about how we move forward as a family, and how we help you carry the load you've been given." The silence that followed was profound, filled with all the things that had been left unsaid for too long. Camilla's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and Kate saw something flicker across her face, surprise, perhaps, or maybe resignation. The children, sensing that the conversation had taken a serious turn, became unusually quiet, their own instinctive understanding of adult emotions making them careful observers rather than active participants. Charles set down his glass carefully, his movements deliberate and controlled. "What did you have in mind?" he asked, but Kate could hear the wariness in his voice, as if he was bracing himself for a conversation he both wanted and feared to have. The stage was set for everything that would follow, though none of them yet understood how profoundly the evening would change their relationships with each other. In the quiet elegance of that dining room, with the soft light of candles creating an atmosphere of intimacy, a family was about to confront truths that had been carefully avoided for months. Kate looked around the table at these people she had come to love so deeply. Her husband, carrying burdens he rarely spoke about. Her father-in-law, struggling to balance personal desires with public duty. Her children, growing up in a world none of them had chosen, but all of them were learning to navigate. And Camilla, who had fought her own battles to find her place in this complicated family structure. Whatever was about to happen, Kate knew it would require all of her strength, wisdom, and love to help guide them through it. But as she looked at Charles's grateful expression and William's determined face, she felt something she hadn't expected: hope. Hope that this family, despite all its complexities and challenges, might finally find a way forward that honored both their public responsibilities and their private hearts. The words hung in the air like morning mist, visible, but somehow untouchable. William's suggestion that they discuss the future had opened a door that everyone at the table knew had been carefully kept closed for months. Kate watched as each person processed what had just been said, their faces revealing the complex emotions that royal training usually kept hidden. Charles was the first to respond, but not with words. Instead, he reached for his napkin and carefully placed it beside his plate, a gesture so deliberate that Kate recognized it as his way of buying time to think. She had observed this habit during other family gatherings, the way he used small, precise movements to create space for his thoughts when faced with unexpected emotional terrain. "I think," Charles said finally, his voice measured but warm, "that might be exactly the conversation we need to have. But perhaps not here, not with the children listening to grown-up worries." George looked up from his dessert with the sharp awareness that 10-year-olds possess when they sense adult tensions. "Are you sad, Grandpapa?" he asked with the directness that only children can manage, cutting through layers of diplomatic language to reach the heart of the matter. The question seemed to surprise Charles, and Kate watched as his carefully constructed composure flickered for just a moment. Here was his grandson, still young enough to ask simple questions that demanded honest answers, still innocent enough to believe that sadness was something that could be acknowledged and somehow fixed. "Not sad, exactly," Charles replied, leaning toward George with the serious attention he always gave to his grandchildren's questions. "But sometimes being grown up means carrying responsibilities that feel quite heavy, like having a backpack that's packed a bit too full." Charlotte, ever the perceptive observer, looked between her grandfather and her step-grandmother with the kind of intuitive understanding that sometimes surprised the adults around her. "Is Grandmama Camilla's backpack heavy too?" she asked, and the question revealed more insight than anyone expected from an 8-year-old. Camilla's response was telling in its carefully controlled emotion. "We all have our heavy backpacks, darling," she said softly, reaching over to smooth Charlotte's hair. But Kate noticed that her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, and there was something in her tone that spoke of resignation rather than mere acknowledgement. William exchanged a glance with Kate, and she could see him making the same decision she was reaching, that this conversation needed to happen, but not in front of the children. Some truths were too complex, too adult, to be processed by young minds that still believed in the absolute goodness of the adults who loved them. "Why don't we move to the drawing room for coffee?" Kate suggested, her tone light, but purposeful. "And perhaps the children could choose some books from Grandpapa's library to take home." The suggestion was met with enthusiasm from George, Charlotte, and Louis, who had been eyeing the impressive collection of books throughout dinner. Charles's library at Clarence House was legendary within the family, floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with everything from classic literature to books on organic farming, architecture, and philosophy. For the children, it was like being given access to a treasure trove. As they moved into the library, Kate noticed how Charles interacted with each of his grandchildren differently, responding to their individual personalities and interests. With George, who had developed a fascination with military history, he pulled down a beautifully illustrated book about the Knights of the Round Table. For Charlotte, who loved stories about strong women, he found a collection of fairy tales featuring brave princesses who saved kingdoms. And for Louis, who was still learning to read, he chose a book with large, colorful pictures of animals from around the world. "Take these home with you," Charles told them, his voice warm with genuine affection. "But promise me you'll tell me what you think of them the next time I see you." Watching this interaction, Kate felt her heart tighten with emotion. Here was a man who had spent his entire life preparing to be king, who carried the expectations of an entire nation, but who was also simply a grandfather who wanted to share his love of learning with the children he adored. The complexity of balancing these different roles was something she was still learning to navigate herself, but seeing Charles do it with such natural grace reminded her why she had grown to love and respect him so much. After the children were settled in another room with their new books, and a nanny who had quietly appeared to supervise their reading time, the 4 adults returned to the drawing room. The atmosphere immediately shifted, becoming more charged with the weight of unspoken tensions that had been building for months. Camilla chose a chair that was somehow both part of the conversation circle and slightly apart from it, a positioning that Kate found telling. William sat forward on the sofa, his posture indicating his readiness to engage in whatever difficult conversation lay ahead. Charles remained standing for a moment, looking out the window at the London evening, before finally settling into his favorite armchair. "Well then," Charles said, his tone attempting lightness, but not quite achieving it. "Where shall we begin?" Kate found herself in the position she often occupied during family discussions, the bridge between different perspectives, the person who could see multiple sides of complex situations and help others find common ground. It wasn't a role she had asked for, but it was one that seemed to come naturally to her, perhaps because she had entered the family from the outside and could observe dynamics that others, being too close, couldn't see clearly. "I think we should begin with honesty," Kate said gently, "about what's been happening, about what we're all feeling, and about what we need from each other." William reached for her hand, a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed by either Charles or Camilla. "Kate's right," he said. "We've all been walking on eggshells for months, trying to be polite and diplomatic, but we're family. We should be able to speak honestly with each other." Charles nodded slowly, but Kate could see the wariness in his expression. As king, he was accustomed to conversations that were carefully orchestrated, where every word was weighed for its potential impact. The idea of speaking without filters, even with family, was both appealing and terrifying. "The truth is," Charles said finally, "I feel as though I'm failing everyone. The public expects me to be the steady, confident leader that my mother was. Parliament expects me to understand constitutional nuances that she learned over 70 years. The Commonwealth expects me to maintain relationships that took her decades to build. And my family." He paused, looking directly at Camilla. "My family expects me to be a husband and father and grandfather while also being a king, and I'm not sure I know how to do both well." The confession hung in the air, raw and vulnerable in a way that royal training typically prevented. Kate felt the courage it had taken for Charles to speak so honestly, and she could see that both William and Camilla were equally affected by his words. "Papa," William said quietly, "no one expects you to be exactly like grandmother. She had 7 decades to grow into the role. You've had barely more than a year, and you're doing it in a completely different world, with different challenges and different pressures." Camilla spoke for the first time since they had moved to the drawing room, her voice carrying years of careful thought. "Charles, you're not failing anyone. But you are trying to carry everything alone, and that's not sustainable. Not for you, not for the institution, and not for us." The way she said "us" caught Kate's attention. There was something in Camilla's tone that suggested she wasn't just speaking about the immediate family, but about something larger, perhaps her own place within the monarchy, or the role she was expected to play as queen consort. "What do you mean?" Kate asked gently, sensing that Camilla had more to say, but was hesitating to voice it. Camilla was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap, her expression thoughtful. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of months of careful consideration. "I mean that I think we need to acknowledge that the monarchy is changing, whether we guide that change or not. The public's relationship with the royal family is different than it was even 5 years ago. People want authenticity. They want to see real human beings rather than perfect symbols, and they want to understand how the institution serves them in the modern world." She paused, looking directly at Charles. "And I think you're exactly the right person to lead that transition, but not if you're trying to do it while also maintaining every tradition and expectation that existed before." William leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Camilla said carefully, "that perhaps it's time to think about succession planning in a more active way. Not because Charles isn't capable or shouldn't be king, but because the monarchy needs to evolve, and that evolution might happen more smoothly with a clearer vision of the future." The words created a stillness in the room that was almost tangible. Kate realized that Camilla had just articulated something that had been in all of their minds, but that none of them had dared to voice directly. The question of William's eventual succession had always been a distant consideration, something that would happen naturally in time. But Camilla was suggesting that perhaps it shouldn't be quite so distant. Charles's reaction was fascinating to watch. Kate expected surprise, perhaps even offense, but instead saw something that looked almost like relief cross his face. "You think I should be considering abdication?" he asked, but his tone was curious rather than defensive. "I think you should be considering what would be best for the monarchy, for the country, and for your family," Camilla replied. "And I think you should know that whatever you decide, you have our support." The conversation had taken a turn that none of them had anticipated when the evening began. What had started as a family dinner intended to address growing tensions had become a discussion about the future of the British throne itself. Kate found herself thinking about the children in the other room, innocently reading their new books, unaware that the adults in their family were discussing decisions that would fundamentally shape their futures. George, as third in line to the throne, would someday face the same pressures his grandfather and father were navigating. Charlotte and Louis would grow up in the shadow of these conversations, their lives forever shaped by the weight of royal responsibility. "There's something else we need to discuss," William said, his voice taking on a more formal tone that indicated he was about to address something particularly significant. "Something that's been affecting all of us, but that we haven't talked about directly." He looked at each of them in turn before continuing. "Harry's absence from our family has created a void that we're all feeling, but it's also created an opportunity to rebuild relationships and establish new patterns. Whatever we decide about the future of the monarchy, we need to make sure we're building something that could potentially include him again, if and when he's ready." The mention of Harry brought another layer of complexity to an already intricate conversation. Kate knew that William thought about his brother constantly, despite the public rift that had developed between them. The empty chair at family gatherings, the careful avoidance of certain topics in public statements, the awareness that every family decision had to be made without input from someone who remained, despite everything, an important part of their lives. Charles's expression grew pained at the mention of his younger son. "I think about Harry every day," he said quietly, "about what I could have done differently, about what I could still do to bridge the gap between us. But I also have to consider the impact of those efforts on the rest of the family, on the institution, and on the public's trust." "Maybe," Kate said thoughtfully, "that's exactly why we need to think about the future differently. Maybe the decisions we make now about succession, about roles and responsibilities, about how we function as a family and as an institution, maybe those decisions could create space for reconciliation that doesn't exist in the current structure. The idea seemed to resonate with everyone in the room, creating a sense of possibility that hadn't been present when the conversation began. Instead of feeling trapped by circumstances and expectations, they were beginning to explore the idea that they might have more control over their destiny than they had realized. But even as Kate felt hopeful about the direction of their discussion, she couldn't shake the feeling that the most crucial moments of the evening were still ahead of them. The conversation had revealed truths and possibilities that needed time to settle, but it had also created new tensions that would need to be addressed before the evening ended. As if sensing her thoughts, Charles stood up again, walking to the window that overlooked the garden. "There's something I need to say," he said, his back still turned to the room. "Something I should have said months ago, but couldn't find the words for." The silence that followed was filled with anticipation and apprehension in equal measure. Kate found herself holding her breath, sensing that whatever Charles was about to share would fundamentally change the dynamic between all of them. The evening had already been full of surprising revelations, but something in Charles's posture suggested that the most important one was yet to come. Charles remained at the window for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, his silhouette framed against the soft glow of the London streetlights. When he finally turned back to face the room, Kate saw something in his expression that she had never seen before, a vulnerability so profound it seemed to transform him from monarch to simply a man carrying an unbearable burden. "The truth is," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this role. Not the way my mother was. Not the way the country needs me to be." The confession hit the room like a physical force. Kate felt William tense beside her, felt Camilla's sharp intake of breath, felt her own heart contract with sympathy and concern. This wasn't the careful, measured doubt of a leader seeking counsel. This was the raw honesty of someone who had reached the limits of their endurance. "Charles," Camilla said gently, rising from her chair, "that's not true. You are stronger than you know, but you're trying to carry everything alone." "But," Charles held up his hand, stopping her approach. "Please, let me finish. I need to say this while I have the courage." He returned to his chair, but sat forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "Every morning, I wake up thinking about the thousands of people whose livelihoods depend on the decisions I make. Every evening, I go to sleep wondering if I failed someone, somewhere, who was counting on me to be better than I am." Kate watched Charles carefully, noting the tremor in his hands that had become more pronounced, the way his voice caught slightly on certain words, the careful control he was exercising over his emotions. These were signs of stress that went far deeper than normal royal pressures. This was a man questioning everything he had spent his entire life preparing for. "When I was younger," Charles continued, "I thought being king would mean having the power to make real changes, to address the problems I cared about, climate change, poverty, the disconnect between modern life and the natural world. But the reality is that being king means being constrained by constitutional limitations, public expectations, and political considerations that often prevent exactly the kind of leadership the world needs." William spoke quietly, but his words carried deep conviction. "Papa, you have made changes. Your work on environmental issues has influenced global conversations. Your prince's trust has changed thousands of lives. Your vision for sustainable communities has become a model for development around the world. But at what cost?" Charles asked, and his eyes moved to Camilla with an expression that Kate found heartbreaking. "At what cost to the people I love? At what cost to my marriage, to my relationship with my children, to my health, to my peace of mind?" The mention of cost to his marriage created a tension in the room that was almost unbearable. Kate saw Camilla's face change, saw her struggle to maintain composure while processing what Charles was really saying. This wasn't just about the burdens of kingship. This was about the impact those burdens were having on every aspect of his personal life. "Charles," Camilla said, her voice steady but strained, "if you're saying what I think you're saying, then we need to be very clear about what we're discussing." "What am I saying?" Charles asked, but Kate could tell from his tone that he knew exactly what Camilla meant, and that this conversation had been building toward this moment for longer than any of them had realized. Camilla stood up, moving to stand near the fireplace, her posture elegant but defensive. "You're saying that you're considering stepping down, that you're thinking about abdication." She paused, her voice taking on a note of something that might have been pain or might have been resignation. And you're saying that part of the reason is the impact on our marriage. The word abdication hung in the air like a thunderclap. It was a word that carried enormous historical weight in British culture, associated with crisis and scandal and the near collapse of the monarchy in 1936. For a British monarch to even consider abdication suggested problems so severe that traditional solutions were inadequate. William's reaction was immediate and visceral. "Papa, you can't seriously be considering that. The country needs you. The Commonwealth needs you. We need you." But Kate found herself looking between Charles and Camilla, seeing something in their interaction that suggested this wasn't the first time this possibility had been discussed between them. There was a familiarity to the way they were navigating this conversation, as if they had been circling around these issues for weeks or months. "Tell me what you're really thinking," Kate said gently, addressing both Charles and Camilla. "Tell us what's been happening that we don't know about." Charles and Camilla exchanged a look that was filled with years of shared experience and mutual understanding. Finally, Camilla spoke, her voice carrying a weariness that Kate realized had been present all evening, but that she was only now fully recognizing. "We've been discussing the possibility for several months," Camilla said. "Not seriously, not as a concrete plan, but as a way of exploring whether there might be alternatives to the path we're currently on." She moved to sit on the arm of Charles's chair, a gesture that was both supportive and somehow final. "The truth is, Charles is brilliant at the work of being king, the constitutional responsibilities, the diplomatic relationships, the ceremonial obligations. But the public nature of the role, the constant scrutiny, the way every aspect of our lives becomes fodder for public discussion, it's taking a toll that I'm not sure is sustainable." Kate felt something click into place in her understanding. "You're worried about his health?" she said. It wasn't a question. Camilla's nod was almost imperceptible, but it confirmed Kate's suspicion. "The stress is affecting everything: his sleep, his appetite, his blood pressure. His doctors are concerned, though they haven't said anything publicly, obviously. But I see him every day. I see the way this role is consuming him." William looked stricken. "Papa, why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you let us help carry some of the load?" "Because you have your own responsibilities," Charles replied. "You have 3 young children who need their father to be present and engaged. You have Catherine, who shouldn't have to shoulder additional burdens because I'm struggling. And you have your own preparation for eventually becoming king, which shouldn't be rushed because of my shortcomings." Kate felt a surge of frustration at Charles's self-criticism, but also a deep understanding of the impossible position he was in. "Charles, what you're describing isn't shortcomings. It's human limitations being pushed past their breaking point by an inhuman system of expectations." "That's exactly what I've been trying to tell him," Camilla said, her voice carrying months of gentle but persistent advocacy. The monarchy survived Edward VIII's abdication. It survived the challenges of the war years, the difficulties of the 60s and 70s, the crisis years of the 90s. It can survive adaptation to meet the needs of a 21st century world. William was shaking his head, clearly struggling to process what he was hearing. "But adaptation doesn't necessarily mean abdication. We can find other ways to adjust the role, to share responsibilities, to make the position more sustainable." "Can we?" Charles asked, and his tone suggested he had given this considerable thought. "The constitutional reality is that certain responsibilities cannot be delegated. The symbolic importance of the monarchy depends on the perception of continuity and stability. Any significant changes to how the role functions would require parliamentary approval, public consultation, and potentially constitutional reform that could take years to implement." Kate found herself thinking about the children again, about George's innocent question about whether his grandfather was sad, about Charlotte's perceptive awareness of adult emotions, about Louis's uncomplicated joy in family gatherings. How would they understand these adult conversations? How would they process the idea that their grandfather might choose to step away from a role that had defined their family's entire existence? "There's another consideration," Camilla said quietly, "one that we haven't discussed yet, but that's been part of our thinking." She looked directly at William before continuing. "You would be an exceptional king. You have the right temperament for modern leadership, the right understanding of contemporary challenges, and the right partner to help you succeed. Most importantly, you have the energy and health to sustain the role for decades, which would provide exactly the kind of stability the monarchy needs." Kate felt William's hand tighten on hers, felt him processing not just the practical implications of what Camilla was suggesting, but the emotional weight of having his future fundamentally altered. They had always known he would be king eventually, but eventually had felt safely distant, allowing them to focus on raising their children and gradually preparing for additional responsibilities. "And Kate," Charles said, looking directly at her, "you would be an extraordinary queen. You understand people in a way that comes naturally to very few individuals. You connect with the public authentically, you manage family relationships with wisdom beyond your years, and you have the strength to support William while maintaining your own identity and priorities." The compliment was touching, but Kate found herself focusing more on the implications of what was being discussed than on the personal praise. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. "Are we talking about immediate abdication, or gradual transition, or simply exploring possibilities?" "We're talking about being honest about realities," Charles replied. "The reality that my health is being affected by stress in ways that concern my doctors. The reality that the monarchy would benefit from younger leadership that better reflects contemporary values. The reality that William and you are already more popular with the public than Camilla and I are, and that your succession might strengthen the institution rather than simply maintaining it." Camilla added, "We're also talking about the reality that Charles has spent his entire life in service to the crown, and that perhaps he's earned the right to choose how he spends whatever years he has left." The phrase, "whatever years he has left," created a chill in the room that was almost palpable. Kate realized that this conversation wasn't just about political or institutional considerations. It was about mortality, about a man facing his own limitations and trying to make decisions that would serve everyone he loved while there was still time to do so thoughtfully. "The doctors," William said, his voice tight with concern. "What exactly have they said?" Charles hesitated, and Kate could see him weighing how much to reveal. "Nothing immediately alarming," he said finally. "But they've recommended significant stress reduction, lifestyle changes that would be difficult to implement while fulfilling royal duties, and regular monitoring of several health indicators that have been concerning." The euphemism "concerning" carried more weight than more dramatic language might have. Kate understood that Charles was trying to be honest without creating panic, but the implications were clear. His health was being affected in ways that required serious attention. "How long have you been thinking about this?" Kate asked. "Since the coronation," Camilla replied. Watching Charles during those ceremonies, seeing the toll that single day took on him, both physically and emotionally, it became clear that the current approach wasn't sustainable long-term. Charles nodded. "The coronation was supposed to be the culmination of everything I had prepared for my entire life. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something I wasn't sure I could endure." The honesty in his voice was devastating. Kate thought about the public perception of the coronation, the pomp and ceremony, the celebration of tradition and continuity, the symbolic passing of authority from one generation to the next. To learn that Charles had experienced it as the beginning of an unbearable burden rather than a triumphant achievement fundamentally shifted her understanding of everything that had happened since. But even as Kate processed the gravity of what Charles and Camilla were sharing, she found herself thinking about practical considerations that they might not have fully explored. The timing of any potential abdication, the public reaction, the impact on the Commonwealth countries, the precedent it would set for future monarchs. All of these factors would need to be carefully considered. "If you're seriously considering this," she said carefully, "then we need to think about it not just as a family decision, but as a decision that will affect millions of people who feel personally connected to the monarchy. We need to think about how to frame it in a way that strengthens rather than undermines the institution." William looked at her with a mixture of surprise and admiration. "You're thinking about how to make this work," he said. "Not whether it should happen, but how it could happen successfully." Kate nodded slowly. "I'm thinking about the fact that Charles has given his entire life to service, and that if he's reached the point where continuing would damage his health and his ability to serve effectively, then maybe the most loving thing we can do is help him find a path forward that honors both his service and his humanity." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications of what Kate had just said. She had, in effect, endorsed the possibility of Charles's abdication while framing it not as failure or retreat, but as a continuation of his lifelong commitment to putting the needs of others before his own desires. But even as they processed this possibility, Kate knew that the most crucial moment of the evening was still ahead of them. The conversation had revealed truths and created new understandings, but it had also raised questions that would need to be answered before anyone could make final decisions about the future. Most importantly, it had created a situation where every relationship in the room would need to be redefined based on new realities. Whatever happened next would determine not just the future of the British monarchy, but the future of their family itself. The silence that followed Kate's words was different from the previous pauses in their conversation. This wasn't the silence of people gathering courage to speak difficult truths. This was the silence of people absorbing the reality that their lives were about to change in ways they couldn't yet fully comprehend. Charles was the first to break it, but not with words. Instead, he stood up slowly, with the careful movements of someone whose body was carrying more stress than it was designed to bear. He walked to his desk, opened a drawer, and withdrew a leather portfolio that Kate recognized as the kind used for important state documents. "There's something I need to show you," he said, returning to his chair. "Something I prepared several weeks ago, after a particularly difficult conversation with my doctors." He opened the portfolio and withdrew several sheets of paper, each bearing the official letterhead of Buckingham Palace. Even from where she sat, Kate could see the formal language and careful spacing that indicated these were legal documents of some kind. "I asked my private secretary to work with constitutional lawyers to explore what would be required if I chose to abdicate," Charles said, his voice taking on the measured tone he used for official business. "Not because I had decided to proceed, but because I needed to understand the practical implications before making any decisions." William leaned forward, his expression a mixture of shock and something that might have been betrayal. "You've been planning this without telling us." "I've been exploring options," Charles corrected gently. "There's a significant difference between planning and preparation. I needed to understand what would be required before I could have this conversation with you intelligently." Camilla reached over and took one of the documents, scanning its contents with the careful attention of someone who had clearly seen them before. "The constitutional requirements are actually less complex than most people assume," she said. "Parliament would need to pass an act of succession, but there's precedent from 1936, and the legal framework exists. More importantly," Charles added, "the timing could be managed in a way that provides stability and continuity. The coronation could take place within 6 months, allowing time for proper preparation, but not so much time that uncertainty creates institutional instability." Kate found herself simultaneously impressed by the thoroughness of their research and troubled by the fact that they had progressed so far in their thinking without involving William and her. "How long have you been working on this?" she asked. "Since August," Camilla replied, "after Charles had what his doctors called a stress-related cardiac episode during a particularly demanding week of state visits." The phrase cardiac episode hit William like a physical blow. Kate saw all the color drain from his face, saw his hands clench into fists, saw him struggle to process this new information. "You had a heart problem and didn't tell us." "It wasn't a heart attack," Charles said quickly. "It was what the doctors described as a warning: irregular heartbeat, chest tightness, elevated blood pressure. But it was serious enough that they recommended immediate changes to my schedule and stress levels. Changes that haven't been possible to implement while maintaining royal duties," Camilla added quietly. "Which is how we started seriously considering alternatives." Kate felt a surge of anger at the impossible situation Charles had been placed in, caught between his duty to serve the country and his need to preserve his health, with no apparent way to honor both responsibilities simultaneously. But she also felt anger at the system that had created this situation, the expectations that made it impossible for even the monarch to prioritize his own well-being without feeling like he was abandoning his responsibilities. "The doctors," Williams said, his voice tight with emotion, "what do they think about abdication as a solution? They think it's the only solution that addresses the root cause of the stress rather than just managing its symptoms," Charles replied. "But they also understand the complexity of the decision and haven't pressured me in either direction." William stood up abruptly, walking to the window where Charles had stood earlier. Kate could see the tension in his shoulders, could sense him struggling to process not just the practical implications of what he was hearing, but the emotional weight of learning that his father had been dealing with serious health concerns without sharing them. "I'm angry," William said finally, his back still turned to the room. "I'm angry that you've been carrying this burden alone. I'm angry that the system puts impossible demands on you. I'm angry that we're even having this conversation. But, mostly, I'm angry that I can't fix this for you." The raw emotion in his voice seemed to break something open in Charles. Kate saw tears gathering in his eyes, saw him struggle to maintain the composure that had been drilled into him since childhood, but that was no longer adequate for the situation they were facing. "Will," Charles said softly, "I need you to understand that this isn't about failure or giving up. If I choose this path, it's because I believe it's the best way I can continue to serve, by ensuring that the monarchy has a leader who can sustain the role for decades to come, rather than struggling through a few more years of diminished effectiveness." William turned back to face the room, and Kate saw that he was crying openly now, no longer trying to maintain royal composure in the face of such deeply personal revelations. "But you're my father," he said simply. "Before you're the king, before you're anything else, you're my father, and I don't want to lose you to stress and overwork and impossible expectations." The conversation had reached a level of emotional honesty that Kate suspected was unprecedented in their family. Royal training emphasized duty over personal feelings, service over individual needs, public presentation over private truth. But the crisis they were facing had stripped away those protective barriers, leaving them confronting realities that couldn't be managed through traditional royal approaches. "You won't lose me," Charles said, rising to embrace his son. "If anything, stepping back from the throne might allow me to be a better father and grandfather, to be more present for the people I love most." As Kate watched father and son hold each other, she felt the weight of the decision that was taking shape before her eyes. This wasn't just about Charles's health or the future of the monarchy. It was about a family trying to find a way to love and support each other while carrying responsibilities that no family should have to bear alone. But even as she was moved by the emotion of the moment, Kate's practical mind was working through the implications of what they were discussing. If Charles abdicated, William would become king while their children were still young, which would fundamentally change the family dynamics they had worked so hard to protect. The children would grow up with a level of scrutiny and pressure that even their current royal status hadn't prepared them for. "There's something we need to discuss," Kate said gently, waiting for father and son to separate before continuing. "If this happens, it changes everything for George, Charlotte, and Louis. They would grow up as the children of the reigning monarch rather than the heir, with all the additional pressures and limitations that involves." The mention of the children seemed to refocus everyone's attention on practical considerations rather than emotional processing. William returned to sit beside Kate, taking her hand in both of his. "We've thought about that extensively," Camilla said. "In fact, it's been one of the primary factors in our considerations. The children are young enough that they could adapt to new realities, but old enough that they would need careful support through the transition." Charles nodded. "Part of the appeal of making this decision now, rather than waiting until my health forces it, is that it could be done thoughtfully, with time to prepare everyone involved, including George, Charlotte, and Louis." Kate found herself thinking about each of her children individually, imagining how they would process and adapt to such dramatic changes in their circumstances. George, serious and responsible beyond his years, would probably understand the duty aspects but worry about his grandfather's well-being. Charlotte, with her emotional intelligence and perceptive nature, would pick up on the adult stress and need careful reassurance. Louis, still so young, would adapt most easily but would need the most protection from public scrutiny. They would need to understand that this isn't about grandpapa being sick or sad, Kate said. It would need to be framed as a positive choice, a decision made from strength rather than weakness. "Exactly," Charles agreed, "which is why the timing and presentation would be crucial. This couldn't be portrayed as a crisis or a failure, but as an evolution, a conscious decision to ensure the monarchy's future strength." William was quiet for a long moment, clearly working through the practical and emotional implications of everything they had discussed. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a new note of resolve that hadn't been present earlier in the evening. "If we're seriously considering this," he said, "then we need to approach it not as a family crisis, but as a family decision. We need to work together to ensure that whatever happens serves everyone's needs: Papa's health, the monarchy's future, the children's well-being, and the country's stability." Kate felt a surge of pride in her husband's response. Despite the shock and emotion of the evening's revelations, he was demonstrating exactly the kind of thoughtful leadership that would be required if he became king sooner than expected. "What would you need from us to make this work?" Kate asked, addressing both Charles and Camilla. "Time," Camilla replied immediately. "Time to plan the transition carefully, time to prepare public opinion, Time to ensure all the constitutional requirements are properly addressed. And support, Charles added. This can't be something I do to you, or something you accept reluctantly. If we move forward, it needs to be something we do together, as a family committed to serving the best interests of everyone involved. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. William's private secretary appeared, looking apologetic but carrying the kind of urgent expression that indicated important business. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said quietly, "but there's been a development that requires immediate attention." The appearance of official business at such a personal moment seemed to underscore everything they had been discussing about the impossible demands of royal life. Even a private family conversation about the most personal and important decisions couldn't be protected from the constant intrusion of official responsibilities. "What is it?" William asked, his tone immediately shifting to the formal register he used for royal business. "There's been a security breach at one of the Commonwealth summits. Nothing immediately dangerous, but it requires coordinated response from multiple royal households. The Prime Minister's office has requested immediate consultation." Kate watched as both Charles and William automatically shifted into crisis management mode, their personal conversation immediately subordinated to official responsibilities. It was exactly the kind of situation that illustrated the point Charles had been making about the impossibility of maintaining healthy boundaries between personal and professional life. But as William stood to address the emergency, something unexpected happened. Instead of automatically taking charge, as he would normally do, he looked directly at Charles with an expression that was both respectful and determined. "Papa," he said, "this is exactly the kind of situation that demonstrates why we need to make changes. You shouldn't have to handle a crisis like this when you've just opened your heart to us about your health concerns. And I shouldn't have to choose between being a son who wants to support his father and an heir who needs to serve the institution." Charles looked surprised by William's response, but Kate could see something else in his expression: relief, perhaps, or gratitude that someone was finally acknowledging the impossible nature of the situation they all faced. "How do you want to handle it?" Charles asked, and Kate realized that this question carried far more weight than its simple words suggested. He wasn't just asking about the immediate crisis. He was asking whether William was ready to begin taking on the primary responsibility for royal leadership. The moment stretched between them, filled with decades of preparation and years of careful transition planning that was suddenly being accelerated by current realities. Kate found herself holding her breath, sensing that how William responded would determine not just how they handled this particular crisis, but how they moved forward as a family and as an institution. "Together," William said finally. "We handle it together. But with the understanding that this is practice for a future that might come sooner than we originally planned." Charles reached out his hand toward William, a gesture of support and transition that felt both deeply personal and historically significant. But as he extended his hand, something remarkable happened that would later become the moment Kate would remember most clearly from the entire evening. Instead of simply taking Charles's hand in a formal handshake or embrace, William looked past his father to where Kate was sitting. Without hesitation, without calculation, with the natural instinct of a man who had learned to turn to his wife for support in moments of crisis, Charles's hand reached not toward William, but toward Kate. It was a small gesture, lasting only seconds, but its significance was enormous. In that moment of transition, when faced with accepting greater responsibility and leadership, Charles's instinct had been to reach for the person who represented the future stability of the monarchy, the person whose wisdom and strength he had come to rely on for guidance through complex family and institutional challenges. The gesture didn't go unnoticed by anyone in the room. William saw it, and instead of being offended, Kate saw him smile with understanding and perhaps even relief. Camilla saw it, and her expression revealed a complex mixture of emotions that Kate couldn't fully interpret, but that seemed to include both sadness and acceptance. But most importantly, Kate saw it and understood its meaning. Charles wasn't just reaching for support in a moment of crisis. He was reaching for the person he believed represented the monarchy's best hope for the future, the person he trusted to help guide the family and the institution through whatever challenges lay ahead. As Kate reached back and took Charles's outstretched hand, she felt the weight of everything that gesture represented. It was an acknowledgement of her role not just as William's wife, but as a future queen who had already proven her wisdom and strength. It was a recognition that the transition of power they had been discussing wasn't just about Charles stepping back and William stepping forward, but about the emergence of a new kind of royal leadership that would require both William and Kate working together. But, perhaps most significantly, it was a moment when protocol and tradition gave way to genuine human connection and trust. In reaching for Kate instead of Camilla, Charles had made a choice that spoke louder than any formal announcement or constitutional document could. He had reached for the future, and, in doing so, had revealed where he believed the monarchy's strength and hope truly lay. The silence that followed that gesture was the deepest of the evening, filled with recognition from all four of them that they had just witnessed something that would change everything. The crisis waiting in the next room would be handled, the constitutional questions would be answered, the public and political implications would be managed. But the image of Charles reaching for Kate, and Kate reaching back without hesitation, would remain with all of them as the moment when the future of the British monarchy was quietly but definitively decided. The hand that Kate held was trembling slightly, and in that tremor she felt the weight of everything Charles had been carrying alone. His palm was warm but damp with the stress of revelation, and his fingers gripped hers with the desperation of someone finally allowing themselves to be vulnerable after decades of forced strength. The silence that filled the room in that moment was unlike anything Kate had ever experienced. It wasn't empty, it was full, heavy with unspoken understandings and shifting relationships. She could feel William watching this exchange, could sense Camilla processing its implications, could hear her own heartbeat as she realized that this simple gesture had fundamentally altered the balance of power in the room. Charles's eyes were fixed on their joined hands, as if he couldn't quite believe he had reached for her, instead of following the protocols that should have governed such a moment. When he finally looked up to meet her gaze, Kate saw something that took her breath away, relief so profound it seemed to transform his entire expression. "Thank you," he whispered, and Kate understood that he wasn't just thanking her for taking his hand. He was thanking her for understanding what the gesture meant, for accepting the responsibility it represented, for not pulling away from the weight of expectation and trust it carried. "Always," Kate replied simply, and in that single word she made a commitment that went far beyond supporting him through this particular crisis. She was accepting a role she had never explicitly been offered, embracing a future she had never formally been asked to consider, stepping into a position of trust and leadership that protocol had never defined but that necessity was now demanding. William's voice, when he finally spoke, carried a note of wonder that surprised everyone. "I've watched you two together over the years," he said. "Watched how you seek each other's counsel, how you support each other through difficult decisions, how you complement each other's strengths. I think I'm only now understanding why that relationship has developed the way it has." Camilla, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke, her voice carrying years of hard-won wisdom. "Charles has always needed someone who could see past the crown to the man underneath. Diana couldn't do that, not really. She was too young, too hurt by the circumstances of their marriage, too focused on her own survival. I tried to do it, but I was always fighting the ghost of what came before, always trying to prove I belonged." She paused, looking directly at Kate with something that might have been gratitude. "But you've never had to fight for your place. You've earned it naturally, through your actions and your character. You're the daughter-in-law he needed, the confidant he could trust, the bridge between his generation and William's." The words hit Kate with unexpected force. She had always known that her relationship with Charles was special, different from the typical dynamic between a monarch and his son's wife. But hearing Camilla articulate it so clearly, hearing her acknowledge it so generously, made Kate realize that what she had experienced as natural affection and mutual respect had actually been something much more significant. "The question is," William said, his tone becoming more formal as he shifted into the leadership mode that would be required for handling the immediate crisis. "How do we move forward from here? We have an emergency to address, constitutional lawyers to consult, family members to inform, and public relations considerations that could determine the future of the monarchy." Charles slowly released Kate's hand, but the connection between them remained palpable. "The emergency first," he said, his voice taking on the steady tone of someone who had found his footing after a period of uncertainty. "But we handle it together, as we discussed. William takes the lead, I provide support and continuity, and we demonstrate that the transition we've been discussing doesn't have to create instability or confusion." Kate found herself thinking about the practical implications of everything that had happened in the past few hours. The children were still in the next room, innocent of the dramatic changes being discussed in their absence. Staff members were waiting for guidance on the security crisis. Government officials were expecting coordinated response from the royal household. The press would eventually need to be informed about whatever decisions were made. "There's something we need to address before we can move forward effectively," Kate said, surprised by the authority in her own voice. "We need to decide what we're committing to tonight and what we're leaving open for future discussion." The three of them looked at her expectantly, and Kate realized that her words had created space for the kind of decisive leadership that the evening's revelations had been building toward. "Charles," she continued, "you've shared that your health requires significant changes to your current role. You've explored the constitutional requirements for abdication. You've indicated that you believe William and I would be effective leaders for the monarchy's future. But you haven't actually made a decision." Charles nodded slowly. "You're right. I've been exploring possibilities rather than making commitments. And, William," Kate continued, turning to her husband, "you've expressed anger about the impossible situation Papa's been placed in, and willingness to accept greater responsibilities earlier than planned. But you haven't said whether you're prepared to become king within the time frame we've been discussing." William was quiet for a moment, clearly processing the weight of what Kate was asking him to consider. "I think," he said finally, "that I'm prepared to accept whatever timeline serves the best interests of Papa's health, our family's stability, and the monarchy's future. But I want to be clear that this isn't something I'm seeking or pushing for. It's something I'm willing to embrace if it becomes necessary." Kate felt a surge of love and pride in her husband's response. He was demonstrating exactly the kind of reluctant but dutiful leadership that had characterized the best British monarchs throughout history, accepting responsibility not because he craved power, but because he understood the importance of service. "And, Camilla," Kate said, turning to address her stepmother-in-law directly, "you've been Charles's strongest advocate for exploring these options, but you haven't said what this would mean for your own role and future." Camilla's smile was sad but genuine. "My role has always been to support Charles in whatever way serves his best interests and the monarchy's needs. If that means stepping back from public duties earlier than planned, if it means redefining my position within the family structure, if it means accepting that my time as queen consort might be shorter than expected, then that's what I'll do." The generosity and grace in Camilla's response revealed something that Kate had always suspected, but that was now confirmed. Beneath all the public controversy and historical complications, Camilla had always genuinely loved Charles and wanted what was best for him, even when that meant personal sacrifice. "Then, I think," Kate said, feeling the weight of the moment, "that we need to make some preliminary decisions tonight before we address the crisis that's waiting for us. Not final, irreversible commitments, but enough clarity that we can move forward as a united family." She looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes before continuing. "I propose that we agree to move forward with formal planning for Charles's abdication, with a timeline that allows for careful preparation and William's gradual assumption of additional responsibilities. We treat this as a family decision made from strength rather than a crisis response, and we commit to supporting each other through whatever challenges the transition presents." The proposal hung in the air for several seconds while everyone processed its implications. Kate had, in effect, taken charge of the conversation and provided the decisive leadership that none of them had been able to offer individually. Charles was the first to respond. "I accept that proposal," he said, his voice carrying a relief that was almost tangible. "And I want to say that your handling of this entire conversation, your wisdom, your compassion, your ability to see the larger picture while remaining sensitive to everyone's individual needs, confirms everything I believed about your readiness for the responsibilities that would come with William's accession." William reached for Kate's hand, squeezing it gently. "I also accept," he said. "And I want to echo what Papa said about your leadership tonight. I couldn't ask for a better partner in facing whatever lies ahead." Camilla's acceptance was quieter, but equally significant. "I accept as well. And I want to say that I'm grateful to have been part of this conversation, to have been trusted with these difficult decisions, and to have witnessed the emergence of the kind of leadership the monarchy will need for the future." With those words, the most important decisions of the evening were made. The constitutional details would need to be worked out, the timing would need to be refined, the public presentation would need to be carefully managed. But The fundamental choice had been made by four people who loved each other and who were committed to serving something larger than their individual interests. The knock on the door that interrupted this moment was different from the previous interruption, softer, more tentative. When Charles called for entry, they were surprised to see George peering around the door frame, his young face serious with concern. "Grandpapa," he said, "we finished our books, and Charlotte wanted to know if you're still sad." She said the grown-ups were using their worried voices. The innocence of the question, coming at such a momentous time, seemed to crystallize everything they had been discussing. Here was the next generation, represented by a 10-year-old boy who was concerned about his grandfather's happiness and who would someday inherit the consequences of the decisions being made in this room. Charles opened his arms to his grandson, and as George ran to embrace him, Kate saw something she hadn't seen all evening. Charles smiled with genuine, uncomplicated joy. "I'm not sad anymore, George," he said, holding the boy close. "I was worried about some grown-up things, but your father and Catherine and Grandmama Camilla have helped me figure out how to make everything better." George pulled back to look at his grandfather's face, studying it with the serious attention that children bring to assessing adult emotions. "Good," he said finally, because Charlotte was getting worried. And when Charlotte worries, she makes everyone else worry too. The laughter that followed George's observation was exactly what they all needed. A moment of lightness that reminded them that despite the weight of their responsibilities, they were still a family who loved each other and found joy in simple moments together. "Should we go tell Charlotte and Louis that everything's all right?" Kate suggested. As they moved toward the door, Charles suddenly stopped and turned back to the room where they had just made decisions that would reshape the British monarchy. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice taking on a note of formality that indicated he was about to say something significant. "When the history of this transition is eventually written," he said, looking directly at Kate, "I want it to be clear that the future Queen of England was the person who provided the leadership and wisdom that made it possible. Tonight, Catherine, you demonstrated exactly the kind of strength and vision that will make you an extraordinary monarch." The words hit Kate with unexpected force. Throughout the evening, she had been focused on supporting others, on finding solutions to complex problems, on helping her family navigate difficult decisions. She hadn't been thinking about herself as a future queen or about how her actions might be perceived by history. But Charles's words reminded her that everything that had happened tonight would indeed become part of the historical record, and that she had played a crucial role in shaping decisions that would affect the monarchy for generations to come. The thought was both humbling and empowering. As they walked together toward the room where the children were waiting, Kate reflected on the events of the evening. What had started as a simple family dinner had become a turning point not just for their immediate family, but for the institution of the monarchy itself. The crisis that had brought William's private secretary to interrupt their conversation was still waiting to be addressed. The constitutional lawyers still needed to be consulted. The Prime Minister's office still required coordination. The public would eventually need to be informed about the decisions that had been made. But as Kate looked around at the people walking beside her, Charles, who had finally found the courage to prioritize his health and happiness, William, who was ready to accept responsibilities earlier than planned because it served the greater good, Camilla, who had gracefully accepted changes to her own role for the sake of the family and institution, and George, innocent of the momentous decisions that had just been made but secure in the love of the adults who were shaping his future. She felt something she hadn't expected to feel. She felt ready. Ready to be the bridge between tradition and modernity that the monarchy needed. Ready to support William as he assumed the crown sooner than anticipated. Ready to help Charles find a path forward that honored both his decades of service and his need for a healthier, more sustainable life. Ready to work with Camilla to ensure that the transition strengthened rather than weakened the institution they all served. Most importantly, she felt ready to be the kind of queen that the 21st century required. Someone who could maintain the dignity and continuity of the monarchy while adapting it to meet the needs of a modern world. The silence that had followed Charles reaching for her hand had indeed said everything. It had said that the future of the British monarchy lay not just with the traditional succession from father to son, but with a new kind of partnership that recognized wisdom and leadership wherever they emerged. It had said that sometimes the most important moments happen not in grand public ceremonies, but in quiet private conversations where people choose to trust each other with their deepest fears and hopes. And it had said that Kate Middleton, The commoner who had married into the most exclusive family in the world had become exactly what that family and that institution needed for the challenges that lay ahead. As they rejoined the children, as they addressed the crisis that was waiting for them, as they began the careful work of implementing the decisions they had made, that silence and everything it represented would guide them through the complexities ahead. The evening that had begun with a simple dinner invitation had ended with the quiet but definitive transfer of the monarchy's future into new hands. And in the weeks and months that would follow, that moment when Charles reached for Kate would be remembered as the instant when everything changed, not through dramatic proclamations or constitutional crises, but through the simple human gesture of one person reaching for another in a moment of need, and finding that the hand that reached back was exactly the one that could lead them all toward a better future.